Hello and welcome to curl 8.11.0, released today, November 6, 2024. So I'm here and I wanted to show you a little presentation about it. So this is me, I'm Daniel Stenberg. I started the curl project. I work for bugfixes, that's my website, that's my Mastodon account. That's the photo is my workplace that I'm doing this presentation at right now. So this is actually release 262, which I think is pretty amazing. It seems to be a really never-ending story. And this time around, we had participation from 55 contributors. And out of those, 25 were authors who actually authored commits. 10 new. So we're at 1,313 commit authors in the curl project so far. Quite a large amount of people. And as you can see, we keep getting quite a lot of newcomers in every release, which I think is great. This time around, we actually spent 49 days in this release cycle until this release, because the previous cycle we did a patch release, so it got shortened by a week, because normally we try to do 8 weeks, and 8 weeks is 56 days. So this is a 7-week release cycle. Anyway, it's been 9,728 days since the first curl release. We've been at it for a while. This time around, we have a security advisory. Again, that seems to be a little bit of a tradition recently, but I approve of people trying hard to find and report security issues, so it's a good thing to find them and fix them. So this time around we have this CVE 2024-9681, and this is a subtle one involving HSTS. And if you don't even know what HSTS is, forget about this. No, HSTS is a way basically for curl to remember that you should not use HTTP anymore on this site. You should always switch to HTTPS for a number of seconds into the future, typically, a week, a year or something. But anyway, and the site can then instruct curl to sort of, this site has HSTS enabled. But when you have a subdomain like x.example.com and another site that is example.com, and one is a subdomain of a parent domain, the subdomain could actually screw it up for the parent domain. It's a niche scenario, but it could be important if you're actually using HSTS in a setup like this. HSTS is still weak in that you're then using HTTP URLs that you just hope are upgraded into HTTPS to become secure and safe, but you're still using HTTP URLs. So I don't think a user should be too surprised if HTTP is actually used for HTTP URLs. Anyway, this was reported by user new function, and he will be rewarded for this. Severity low because of these weird requirements, because it's a HSTS, since you're using HTTP URL anyway, so it is expected to be HTTP every now and then. So yeah, and really my description here was a little bit short, brief, and maybe too short for you. So go read our advisory for this, because I've tried to really detail this, so you should be able to really understand all the subtleties of this. And if you're using HSTS, this might be a less sort of homework for you to read up on. And make sure that you patch your curl or you upgrade to curl 8.11.0 to fix the problems. So we ship a few new things in this release, hence the .0 here in the version number 8. So, for example, we finally fixed this was not finally, but anyway, I made sure that when you use the --dump header function option, is also called -D for just dumping header contents, and you can dump it to a file. And now the create adheres option work for that file as well. So in case you want to save it into a file in the subdirectory, this now works, even if the subdirectory doesn't exist when you invoke the curl command. We support P12 now, the PKCS12 format for GNU-TLS, which we didn't before. We provide build options to disable the IPFS support that we have in curl. And the IPFS support is not really IPFS native support, it's just a mapping for IPFS to use an IPFS gateway. So it's actually internally converting the IPFS URL into a HTTPS URL. So it's not native IPFS, but it supports IPFS URLs this way. Anyway, now you can actually disable this in the build in case you want to. You don't care for IPFS at all. The IPFS support is only provided in the curl tool, not in the library. And we introduce early data, TLS 1.3 early data support for curl. It's limited now to just the GNU-TLS backend, but this is it's going to be introduced in other backends going forward, I'm pretty sure. So early data is a way for a client or for a participator in the TLS handshake to send the data earlier in the handshake. Pretty much a way to reduce round trip time when you set up a connection to a host that you already had a connection with before. Pretty nice actually. And we now consider WebSocket support official, so it's no longer experimental in curl. It's been experimental for 2 years, and now it's here, officially supported. Go knock yourself out, try it out, use it, and tell us how it works. And I mean, the only difference here by calling it official is that now we also stick to the API and use how it works, right? So we won't break the API going forward, which while it was experimental, we still had that ability, or we had that caveat that we could have done it. We never did. So in this release, those 5 rather minor changes, I would say. We also ship a record amount of bug fixes, 266 of them in 49 days. So a kind of an amazing bug fix frequency over these 7 weeks. Anyway, I went through that list and I picked my favorite ones, and they turned out to be 31. Or actually, I had to pick, so I had to filter it pretty hard. So we fixed things in the build. So now we have, for example, Victor has worked really hard to document all the -d and environment things options for CMake. So now you can much better understand exactly what options are available and provided and how you should use them when you build curl with CMake. And really, Victor has really worked hard on the CMake build for several months recently. So the CMake build of curl is now top-notch, quite on par with the regular configure build. There are minor differences in support for some things, but they're minor. And now we also have support to do quote-unquote Unity builds with configure. Unity builds being, put all the C codes, C files into a single file and build only that. Compile a single C file instead of 300 or whatever it is in curl. So in some cases that makes it for a much faster build. It depends on your environment and so on. And especially if you build on Windows, there's a significant performance boost. For me, on Linux, on a fast SSD, on a fast CPU, there's virtually no difference. It just complicates matters, so I don't do this. But anyway, it's an offer. You can do it, and you can try it out, and if it makes you happier, then go with it. And now you can also build better with Russells on Mac OS when you build with configure. A tiny detail, but we're expanding our support for all these weird things. And we fixed the curl tool side. Maybe not that much this time around, but we did things like this. For example, now we detect ECH support dynamically and not at build time, meaning that if you switch if you have different libcurl installations and you switch to another one and using the same curl tool, just different libraries, it will now detect ECH on and off by itself without having it at build time. So, and really that's the way it's meant to be. The curl tool is supposed to be fairly independent from the library and is supposed to detect those things dynamically. And so that was just a mistake. We fixed it. And now one of these things that we haven't supported before, basically because it was a little bit tricky, is to support both show headers and remote header name. Basically, because this remote header name option is when curl scans for that content disposition header in the response headers and use that file name to save. Right? If you want to download a URL and you have the file name in the content disposition headers, and if you at the same time wanted to see headers, because then you could potentially, well, you would get headers before you know which file name to use to save this data under. So then you wouldn't know which file name to use. So it was a bit of you got data before you know where to put it. And I fixed it in this version. So now you can use this combination. Previously, curl would forbid this combination and say, it doesn't work, don't do this. Now you can, because it'll just save the data in memory before it knows the file name. When it knows the file name, it'll dump it out there. Easy peasy, should work nicely. And I shipped this feature called --skip existing I think in curl 10.0. Basically a way to skip your download if there is a local file present already. And I missed, it didn't work for parallel transfers downloads. So now it does. So it just works better. It's a pretty neat way to make sure that you don't try to download things again that you already downloaded before. We did a lot of things in libcurl, of course. That's the bulk of the code. That's the big thing we're working on. We fixed a crash actually, when you limited the amount of connections to a single host, and it would clean up the connection cache and it would crash. Fixed it. We removed, previously we would have some fun convenience type defs, if you will, if you use some special conditions, you could get curl to be more strict about verifying those pointers called curl sh, and curl m. But I had to get rid of those convenience type defs and going back to they're now always just void pointers in the headers because of how the undefined behavior sanitizer works. I blogged about this. It's a complicated issue, but I had to backpedal that a little bit to make sure that we fixed warnings and don't break anything. We had a problem with FTP. This is a regression that we broke FTP uploads when uploading from standard input, meaning that we don't know the size of the file to upload beforehand. So it was some kind of breakage involved there. We had a problem with HSTS. The same feature that I mentioned, the CVE. For another problem with HSTS is that we actually didn't parse the protocol exactly correct. So we would sometimes miss out the max age property because we didn't handle the so-called implied LWS properly. With LWS is then pretty much white space around some keywords in the header. So now we support it better, and now I therefore parse HSTS better. It was actually suggested to be a security problem, but in the end we deemed it not to be a security problem. We fixed more pointer typecast. This is also in this undefined behavior sanitizer cleanup. So we now do much better handling with a lot of function pointers really internally. We had some minor problems or bugs with we have this internal printf implementation for legacy reasons really, and I mean it's been with us since the beginning, and we do that. We implemented this function originally to make sure that our printf that we use internally works the same everywhere, because at least back in the 90s they didn't. And it turned out that we ignored the length modifiers for these options, %O, %X, and %X, and we also didn't treat the %O properly as unsigned. Now we do. Pretty much now they work even more like the sort of quote-unquote normal printf. And really, we discourage people from using the curl printf functions in their own applications. So you really shouldn't suffer from this at all, because these are functions you shouldn't use. We've mentioned that a long time, but don't do it. But I'm sure there will be some users anyway, and it exists in the API, or there are actually a whole bunch of functions. I think there are like 8 of them, all these different printf, fprintf, sprintf, smprintf, blah blah blah. Anyway, so we fixed that. More libcurl things. In a previous release, again I think it was in 8.10.0, we changed how we clean up the connection pool after. If you make an application that does a lot of connections using the multi-interface in libcurl, and then you clean it up, how curl would close down that connection pool would be slightly different from there on. Therefore, it would do callbacks in a slightly, well, it's not really a new way, but maybe in a way that it actually, well, it might be new. For some, that was a bit surprising, and that callback would come from within the curl multi-cleanup function. And anyways, so if that callback comes to the application during the cleanup, curl had already sort of marked the multi-handle as invalid, which made it complicated to applications. So we fixed that by delaying marking the multi-handle as invalid to make sure that those callbacks are a little bit easier to manage for applications. I know this is really subtle and complicated, so if you're not involved in doing these kind of applications and getting these callbacks, forget about that. We fixed the bug where we wouldn't properly acknowledge the connect timeout when using the well, probably, pretty much, yeah. The connect timeout was ignored during some conditions, stupidly enough. I did a fix where we now cache the netrc file in memory instead of just rereading it every time when we want to read it. And this is good because it turns out, so for example, you could, as a convenience, create a temporary file or read it from a pipe or read it from somewhere, and if you would have a redirect, curl do a redirect, and then it would try to read the netrc again, it would fail if that file was just temporary or a pipe or something. Now it won't try to read it again because it has it cached, so it's actually a functionality improvement and a performance improvement. I think what we should be watching for here is that I set a cap for how big netrc file we will cache. So there's a slight risk that someone has a humongously huge netrc file and that will cause problems, but we'll see. I'm sure someone will whack me over the head if this becomes a problem. We now also, the story of Poll is a long and a sad story in general, and this is a story of Poll in Apple operating systems, primarily Mac OS originally, but it has sort of tainted off on the other Apple operating systems, iOS and all those. But anyway, up until now we have pretty much avoided using Poll on those because of previous problems, several previous problems over the years. But now we again enable Poll if Poll exists on the platform. So we now we use Poll more, even on Apple operating systems, primarily to avoid the problems with 1024. More sockets than Select is built to support. But what this has done this extra little thing here, but we avoid Paul on these platforms if there are no sockets to wait on, because that's exactly where the old Apple problem lies. That is, it doesn't really behave correctly if you're trying to use Paul as a portable sleep function, which we also did before, but we don't do that now. We fixed the problem with redirects and using credentials in the URL. Complicated thing, let's not get into the details. Starting with this version, we normalize the IPv6 address in a URL even more than before when you're using the URL API. That is, if you're using a URL with an IPv6 numerical IPv6 address, we pretty much always normalize it now. That is, we throw it through the parser and we output it again with the IPv6 to text function as a way to make it easier to, for example, compare IPv6 URLs. If you're providing URLs with IPv6 addresses, it's good to have that normalized so that it will be easier to compare them, because they are more likely to then end up the same, rather than, because when you provide an IPv6 address, you can be really crazy. You can provide it in a bazillion different ways, and so they end up completely impossible to compare unless you normalize them. Then you at least have a chance to compare them. Previously, we would only normalize if the new version of the generated output would be shorter than the original version. Now we always do it. That means that it'll always, for example, use the same casing of the hexadecimal numbers and so on. So we always go with the lower case. Previously, it would then leave, for example, mixed casing, so it would be harder to compare. And we fixed protocol details, of course. So, for example, we fixed a quick thing, so we increased the maximum window size, the default one, with the NGTCP2, which is the only one we say is not experimental for quick support. We fixed connection reuse on HTTP3 connections, which is pretty good. It makes it faster. We fixed session cache for quick in the GNU TLS build. We improved embed TLS, the backend there for the TLS sessions when using TLS 1.3, and we had these problems with the close notify on the S channel, backend S channel being the Windows native one. We also removed a bunch of when you did use curl built with S channel, for example, you do that when you use curl that is shipped with Windows, and you use the -v option for give me the verbose output, please. Anyway, it would be ridiculously verbose and a little bit too verbose when it comes to S channel interactions or TLS data, because just mostly more or less debug output left in the code. So it would, I would say, it would talk a lot more than was actually helpful. So now a bunch of those verbose output texts are moved into just debug output. Yeah, enable those when we debug stuff. Don't do that now. So we also improved the quick backend to use these other improved function calls to increase performance. We fixed section cache with quick in the wolfSSL backend. And okay, as you can see, a lot of things, and these are just my favorite ones. So there's so much to read. You should go read the full changelog if you really want to find out more. We did something, for example, in the test suite, we generate a file called lib1521.c. It generates a huge file that actually tests, I think, all libcurl options with different inputs, sort of, minimum value, maximum value, some value in between, so the null pointer, blah, 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 to make sure that libcurl handles that for every possible option that you can throw at it. And we generate that in the build when you run the test suite, but it wasn't done atomically, which was a mistake, because sometimes then when you built it in parallel, it could sometimes do other things with the partially generated file before it was completed, ending up in tiers. And Now it doesn't do that. Now it generates it atomically, and things are better. We had a lot of test cases with actually had a valgrind disable instruction, because for reasons those test cases failed in the past, which was kind of fun, because when I removed these disabled instructions, I found memory leaks in libssh2 that I then fixed in libssh2, but they were hidden because we had valgrind disabled. Kind of fun. Improved libssh2 at the same time, and I mean, disabling valgrind is unnecessary, and we want it there in tests so that we can find things like memory leaks, even if they end up in third-party libraries. And I then was also in sort of while in the test suite, we have this requirement on some tests that they only work when you build a debug build of curl, because when you build a debug build of curl, it can instrument more things, you can control more things in somewhat ugly ways, but useful to test things. But it also limits the test, right? Because it only works when you actually build a debug build, and most users, in most situations, you don't build a debug build, and you should never ever use a debug build in production, for example. So if you build a production curl and you want to test it, it's bad to have test cases then require a debug build, because it limits the number of tests that you can run. And so I fixed that superfluous requirement on 38 different tests. So now more tests run on curls that are not built for debug. So there. And similarly, we also add more enforced use of IPv4 in the test suite, because again, when running test suites in parallel, it turned out that sometimes it would connect to the wrong server or a server from the previous test. It was complicated. Now it works better to run more tests in parallel. So one of our sort of ongoing projects and work, maybe the recent year, during the 2024 at least, has been to slowly and gradually improve the test suite and make sure that it works better to run in parallel. And the test suite has really improved in its parallelism and the parallel ability to. So now you can really run the test suite highly parallel, and it will then complete quite quickly if you have a suitable enough machine to do it. I mean, on my computer, I can complete the test suite using valgrind within a few minutes, which is pretty awesome because there are a lot of tests. So I want to then talk about maybe what we're going to remove in this next release. And yes, we are going to remove hyper from curl starting after this release. So in the first release of 2025, there will not be any hyper support left anymore in curl. This has been talked about, discussed, and I have showed it before. So this should not come as a surprise to anyone. So now hyper is out. So whatever we did before, or whatever you wanted to do with hyper, now you can't do that anymore because we're removing it. And I mean, there's been a long story of how we introduced it, how we've tried to make people use it, and all of that. And I will write a separate blog post about this removal going forward. But we pretty much have decided that the experiment to add this support has been a failure to some degrees. We have gotten some benefits out of it as well. So not a complete useless waste. It's not just a waste of time and effort, but in the end it didn't work out. People don't seem to want this, and we don't seem to have any developers who want to work on it. So we're gonna rip it out again too, and it'll simplify a lot of things internally. So it's actually to some degree a benefit for developers of curl, because it makes it easier again to write curl code. And I want to emphasize that in 2025, later in 2025 than in May, we're going to remove support for TLS libraries that don't have 1.3 support, which then currently means that bare SSL and secure transport support will be dropped in May 2025. And from my understanding, there's no chance that secure transport will add this support because it's a legacy API on Apple operating systems that's not changing, and they don't use it themselves, so it's a dead end. And bare SSL is that's written by a single guy, by the way, but it doesn't seem to be moving in that direction either. So most likely these two TLS backends will be dropped in May 2025, which also incidentally makes the code simpler because it reduces the amount of TLS backends, which makes it easier to, refactor things, add things, work with internal code, because it makes you have to do less work when doing TLS related changes. Okay, so the next version is likely to become the curl 8.12.0. I'm saying that because we typically have features coming. So unless there's a really bad regression, so we have to do a patch release, we're going to merge changes and bump it. We'll see what happens. So some other things that possibly might be coming next, or features, things, PRs that are sort of in the queue coming up, is we have a proposal for an connection event callback. Someone wants to know when there's a go away signal over the connection where you do HTTP2. And currently we can't, that's not exposed in the API. An application can't know when that happens. So maybe we should add one of those connection event callbacks. When we do, maybe we could use that to provide other events. Maybe not only go away, maybe there could be others. We have had this one, which has been sort of fallen a little bit in the cracks between the fingers, my fingers at least. An option to disable WebSocket autopong. Someone has requested, and I have a PR coming for curl info HTTP auth used, a way for an application to figure out which authentication was used when you did HTTP authentication in a previous request. Basically, you do a request and you say, hey, it's fine to use one of these different authentication methods, but when the transfer was completed, you want to know which one was actually used. A fair request, I think, and I have a PR for it. We have, I've mentioned this PR before, it still hasn't landed, then obviously send only a part of dash data. So when you want to do an HTTP post of a file, but only a portion of that file, maybe you have a 3 GB file and you just want to send the first 200 bytes. That's the feature for you. We'll see if that lands. And we have ongoing work for quicken the kernel. I don't think this will land in this period, but we'll see. Quicken the kernel is it requires that you have a kernel module loaded, so it's a Linux kernel thing with which then adds quick support to the Linux kernel. And if you do that, this is the code in curl then that would use that curl module, that kernel module, curl call. Okay, so some other things. I'm pretty sure there will be others. So this is just a taste of possibly things that might get merged. I'm sure something else will be merged as well. The next release is then scheduled to happen on January 8th in 2025, the first one of the next year. That's the URL that's going to be automatically updated over this coming release cycle with the pending release notes, the planned things, that how the release might turn out or will turn out, because that's work in progress things. So we have this 8-week release cycle as always, right? That's today, release Wednesday, and then we have a 10 days cool down period just to make sure that everything works. If there's any bad regression in this period of time, we will do a follow-up patch release. So if there's any bad regressions within a few days here now, we will do a patch release on next week, a .1 release. Ideally, hopefully, cross all the fingers. Let's hope we don't have to. this time, maybe this time we won't do it. And anyway, and then 10 days later, after this Wednesday, on that Saturday, we open the feature window. We have a 3 weeks feature window open, merging features and changes, and then we close it and we say no more features, feature freeze. That's another Saturday, and then we have 25 days of feature freeze, during which we only merge bug fixes, and then we have a release Wednesday. So this is today, November 6, November 16, December 7, and then on January 8, 2025, we do the next release. That's the plan here. Who knows if it'll stick. And this particular time, in this particular release cycle, I mentioned this on that Saturday, November 16, we opened the feature window, but I also want to flag that in this particular release window, we have what I call the Slowember 2024, because I'm going to be away next week and the 2 weeks following that. And those 2 weeks following that are within the feature window. So possibly my absence during this period, or my Slowember might affect my ability to merge things during that feature window. So possibly I'm going to be the reason why we can't merge too many features during this release cycle. It doesn't really matter, I think, because it's not a big problem. Either someone else will merge it, or if we don't merge it, it'll be another release cycle. The release cycles never end, so it won't matter too much. But ideally for me, it's going to be nice. That's the plan, at least. Pretty much, I'm saying that my slow period starts on Monday next week, because Monday next week I have these starting 3 weeks of traveling. Now, and if you have anything for your company, curl work, support commercially, get in touch and we can help you out. And especially this time, want to highlight something that I'm going to talk more about in a post about tomorrow, that I call Rock Solid Curl, which is the new way of long-term support curl releases for commercial customers. That site works. You can go there and check it out now. I'm going to blog about it, and there'll be more noise about it tomorrow. If you see this in the future, that was before. Okay, anyway, so if you find any curl issues, bugs, anything, hit up the GitHub webpage, GitHub repository thing, and submit every detail, and we will work on fixing it for the next release. If you find or suspect a security problem, report it to us on hackerone.com/curl, and you might get a cash reward if we deem it accurate and assess. We agree with you that it is a security problem. Recently, we've got quite a few that have not turned out to be security problems, but I think that's still fine. I also want to just mention that we have this awesome bunch of top sponsors in the curl project. They extended this time around, so a few more companies, and these are companies that pretty much all of provide infrastructure services, or they fund a lot of things that makes sure that we can continue running the curl project in as smooth manner as we do, right? Making sure that everything works, runs, and continues to do that the way we want to and the way we think it should. So thank you, nice sponsors. That's what I wanted to bring to you today, curl.11.0, and go get it, try it out, and have fun. And I'll see you in another release presentation shortly. Bye.